So up to this point, we've talked about the different types of variables that we have. We've talked about operational definitions. We talked about the two general types of statistics. The very last thing we need to know when it comes to understanding our variables is whether or not our variables are reliable or valid. What I mean by that is not necessarily is it reliable or is it valid, but to what degree it is reliable or valid. So let's go ahead and talk about each of these two terms. Now, when we say that a variable is reliable, what we're saying is that the data we collect, the numbers, are consistent. They don't change much. And so reliability is the consistency of a measure. And so, for example, height and weight should be fairly consistent for a person. Someone's height and weight shouldn't change too much from time to time. Something else that might be fairly consistent is personality traits. That if someone who's extroverted is going to be extroverted most of the time, and so we would call that consistent. And so personality traits should also be consistent for a person. Now, it's important to remember that reliability is not a yes or no question, that there are many types of reliability. So we're just talking about reliability in general. If you go on and you take a research methods course, you'll talk about all the different types of reliability, things like test-retest reliability, internal consistency reliability, split-half reliability. We're just going to say reliability in general, and that's all we're really going to be concerned about in this course. So reliability is not a yes or no question. A variable is not reliable or is reliable. It's to a certain degree, and so a variable may be more reliable than another variable, or may be high in reliability. But it's not a yes or no question. It's not it is reliable or it is not reliable. Alright, so a question might be, which is more reliable, height or weight? Now, if you said height, then you would be correct. That people's height changes less or varies less than someone's weight. So height does change, especially when someone is growing up, and so through their childhood, they'll increase in height, and so that will change, but it's fairly consistent. The change is slow. And once you reach adulthood, it doesn't change much at all. And so it is high in reliability. Now, weight is still fairly high in reliability as well, but it's not as high as height is in reliability. Weight fluctuates more. That depending on the time of day, and also maybe the week or across time, that weight will fluctuate, and so it'll be less reliable than height, but for a particular person it'll still be fairly consistent. And so reliability again is not a yes or no question. Often it is in comparison to other things, and so in this case height would be more reliable than weight would be. Validity, on the other hand, is when we measure something and that measurement relates to the construct of interest. In other words, we can say that validity is when a measure measures the construct of interest. So again, just like with reliability, there's many types of validity. We'll just be concerned with validity in general. We'll talk about two types later on in this semester. But just in general, that if we use a scale, in other words, a weighing scale, if we use a scale, that scale should be measuring weight and nothing else. I mean, that's the whole point of a scale, that it should measure weight. And if it does, then we'll say that that scale is high in validity. Same thing with a ruler. A ruler should measure height or distance. And if it does that, then we'll say that that measurement or that ruler, that variable, is high in validity. So a ruler, on the other hand, measures extroversion very poorly. In other words, a ruler doesn't tell us much about personality. It's not related to personality. So if we're using a ruler to measure personality, then we would say it is low in validity. And so you'll see, just like with the types of variables, when we categorize them, the context matters. So how are we measuring, and how do we measure? Is it high or low in validity? Is it really measuring what we want it to measure? And so that's what validity is. And so just like with reliability, validity is not a yes or no question. It's a more or less question. So again, there's many types of validity, and in some cases some validity is higher than others depending on the measurement that we're using. So again, it's in comparison to. And so we wouldn't say something is valid or isn't valid. We would say that it is high in validity or low in validity, or higher than something else in validity or lower than something else in validity. So it's not a yes or no question. Alright, so for a question here to kind of quiz you a little bit, which is more valid, a ruler for height or a personality questionnaire for the trait extroversion? Now, if you said a ruler for height, then you would be correct that if I have a ruler, it's going to be high in validity when I'm measuring height or distance. A personality questionnaire, on the other hand, does have some validity to it, but it is lower than what a ruler would be for height. If you think about a personality questionnaire, it's someone's self-report, and someone's self-report is fairly subjective. And so because it's subjective, the validity of the personality questionnaire will be lower than, let's say, a ruler for height. So in this case, a ruler for height would be a more valid measure than would a personality questionnaire for the trait extroversion. But we would still say that the personality questionnaire would have some validity. So again, it's not a yes or a no question. So let's go ahead and finish up this lecture today by talking about the relationship between reliability and validity. And so there is a relationship between the two. It's not a mutually exclusive relationship, but there is some overlap, but you need to know what that overlap is. And so a measure that is high in validity is going to be high in reliability. And if you think about it with the ruler example, that if I measure someone's height and it's a valid measure of height, it's high in validity, then as I measure that person, it's going to be reliable. In other words, we're going to get the same height for that person over and over again. So if a measure is high in validity, it's going to be high in reliability. However, the opposite is not necessarily true. So what I mean by that is that a measure that is high in reliability does not necessarily mean it's high in validity. It may be, but it may not be. We actually don't know. And so a good example of that is ruler and the personality trait of extroversion. I can measure someone's height all day long, and I'm going to get the same numbers. I'm going to get the same feet and inches. So in other words, it's high in reliability. However, that height, that measurement of height, is going to tell me nothing about a person's personality. In other words, extroversion. So in that case, it's high in reliability, but it's not high in validity. And so the two are related. Just remember that a measure that's high in validity will have high reliability, and that a measure that's high in reliability may be high in validity, but it may not be. So just because it has high reliability doesn't necessarily mean it has high validity. So that concludes the second lecture of the class. Now please remember that there are a couple of review questions, so make sure you press that arrow at the bottom of the screen. Alright, well, thank you for your time, and I will see you in class on Thursday.